Do you think you'd murder me, Joe?
Yes.
That's gruesome, Joe. That's horrible.
Yes, it is.
And you don't blame me if I say I hope you never get out of this place.
I hope I never do either.
This man that you just saw is Joseph Kallinger, a very disturbed man that committed his most horrific crimes with the help of his very young son, Michael. Joseph Lee Brenner III was born on a cold day of December 1935 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Joe arrived in a family where his presence was more of a burden than a source of happiness. His home was a complete horror, filled with arguments, fights, alcohol, drugs, and mental health issues. To make matters worse, his father, in an act of cowardice, decided to abandon the family, leaving his mother with anxiety and depression. She couldn't take it anymore, and just 2 years after Joseph's birth, he was put up for adoption and taken in by a couple of Austrian immigrants, Stephen and Anna Kallinger. This is why he is known as Joseph Kallinger. Finally, Joe could enjoy a normal childhood with a good European family. But nothing could be further from the truth. The adoptive family was much, much worse than the previous one. It was everything multiplied by 1,000. It's something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Shortly after arriving at his new home, he began to suffer brutal punishments, leaving him with an hernia. The little boy couldn't ride a bike, go to birthday parties, or celebrate his own. He couldn't play with his friends or the neighborhood kids either. His obligation was to go to school, and after that, work in the family shoe shop, the only profession he would pursue in the future. His adoptive parents used to make him kneel on sharp rocks, lock him in the closet, starve him. But this was the mildest of what they did to him. The rest is so horrific that I can't even tell it in here. At just 11 years old, the little boy starts stealing money from his parents to take neighborhood kids to the movies in an attempt to make friends. But his parents realized what he was doing and got punished. And that wasn't the first time, because Joseph was so desperate to make friends that he preferred to suffer. Also, with a young age, he started having very strange sexual fantasies. He cut a hole in his wall, you know for what, and also had a knife nearby and pictures of men and women. And just during that time, he started hearing voices telling him to cut someone. So he waited for a boy and led him to the woods. But he panicked and ran off into the deep of the woods and never harmed the boy. It was his first time doing things like that, but other times his victims weren't that lucky, although he didn't murder anyone at that time. Remember, he was just a child then. And seeing how his childhood was, one could predict what he would do later. Joe tried to have a normal life. His dream was to become a playwright, and he even performed A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. That's where he met his first love at just 15 years old, but his parents didn't want him to see her, only them know why. So they started putting pressure on him to leave her, but young Joe stood up to his parents and ended up marrying her and having 2 lovely children together. They were a happy couple for a while, but he started to feel the consequences of his childhood. Maybe because he learned it from his adoptive parents, but he started behaving quite like them, leaving no choice to his wife to just leave him and go with another man. After the divorce would come his first hospitalization, being diagnosed with amnesia, faintings, sexual anxiety, nervousness, and even mild sadism. Just some months later, he managed to make another woman fall in love with him. This time, they didn't have 2 children, they had 5. But again, he was extremely abusive with his family, even inflicting the same punishments on them that he had suffered from his adoptive parents. He just went from victim to executioner. Also, he started to have a fantasy with fire, setting fire to his own home multiple times, collecting the insurance's money. After years of suffering, his 3 little kids went to the police to report him. They told them absolutely everything, so the police went to the family's home searching for Kallinger. Not surprisingly, he denied all accusations. But what's more surprising, his wife Elizabeth did deny them too, covering her husband's back. But anyways, it didn't matter. The shoemaker was handcuffed and imprisoned. While in prison, they conducted another forensic exam, concluding that he had a kind of paranoid schizophrenia, so doctors suggested that he should be sent right away to a psychiatric hospital. But despite the doctor's diagnosis, the court decided that he was fit to stand trial, being sentenced to almost a year in prison. He didn't even complete it. After just some months, he was walking the streets again. He arrived home, and those poor kids were terrified of his dad. Again. So, to avoid horrible things, they had to send an affidavit saying that they made that up. The court believed it, so they canceled the sentence and criminal record, including the psychological treatment recommended by the psychiatrists. Worst decision ever. In the following year, Joseph suffered a psychotic break and began to hear the voice of God. The voice, that he named Charlie, whispered to him to massacre the whole humanity, in its entirety. A pretty tall order for one man, you might think. Well, Joseph didn't. He decided to follow the orders. It was 1973, and Joseph started planning his macabre plans, but he needed a sidekick, a trusted person to help him carry out his idea without being betrayed. And what better than his son, Michael, one of the kids that went to the police? He was a seemingly normal child, yet manipulated and a victim of his father. "I'm glad I did it, Dad," the teenager told him after the perverse request. And this is how Michael became an accomplice to the crimes and the best assistant of this disturbed serial killer. To be honest, he was enthusiastic to do that with his father. So, was he really a victim? Their first victim was a young Puerto Rican boy who was kidnapped and dragged to an abandoned factory. There, Joseph used that boy as an object to teach Michael everything about their new mission. So it was incredibly brutal and slow for that poor boy. And after hours of suffering, they finally murdered him. But this wasn't even their most disgusting murder. Just after some months, Kallinger killed his own son, Joey, drowning him and throwing his body among the remains of a building. The shoemaker waited a few weeks to report Joey's disappearance to the police, but they didn't suspect him since his criminal record was non-existent. Police started a thorough investigation, finding the body of the poor boy near the Kallinger's home. But Kallinger made a mistake. His impatience led him to claim a $45,000 life insurance policy just after his death, a life insurance that was issued just shortly before the boy's death. So, the company that was suspecting foul play, it was quite obvious to be honest, didn't pay out the claim and alerted the police. This made the detectives investigate, and although being convinced of the father's responsibility, they never found evidence to link the father with the murder.
You murdered your own son?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
He was a sacrifice. I was to murder 3 million people on planet Earth. And he was a sacrifice to see if I could murder one of my own. At the end of murdering all the people on Earth, I was going to murder my own family and then take my own life and become God.
Like father, like son, they did horrible things to defenseless people, and they weren't caught, so they felt unstoppable. They felt that they couldn't be caught, so from then on, they both started a tremendous hunt in which, again, looked for easy prey, mainly young women whom they would attack in their own homes. Joseph was just a coward. All were easy victims for him, just young and defenseless people. Over the next 6 weeks, they pretended to be salesmen so they could enter the house of their victims. They did this with at least 4 families, but the case that stands out the most is the one that happened in a little town in New Jersey. It is 1975. Joseph and Michael are looking for women and money when they find the perfect home. They are in a small town, so if a stranger is strolling by, they would notice, and the residents did. They are walking by the neighborhood pretending to be salesmen, and then knock on the door. Dee Dee opens the door, a woman in her 20s who is accompanied by her son and his grandmother. You can just imagine. It is quite easy to overpower them. He is going to do horrible things to Dee Dee, but little by little, more family members arrive. Dee Dee's mother, sister, and brother-in-law. They all coming one by one, so it is easy to surprise and tie them in the basement. Once every family member is in the basement and unable to defend themselves, Michael starts looking for money while Joseph does horrible things to them. The last person to arrive is Maria Fashing, the nurse that is taking care of the elderly woman. She is terribly unlucky because she didn't even have to see the grandma, but decided to stop by that afternoon to see how her patient is doing. As soon as Joseph opens the door, he pushes Maria down the stairs and forces her to do things with the only kidnapped man, the boyfriend of one of the sisters. But the young nurse refuses to do it. Joseph is super infuriated and in an outbreak of anger kills her. The screams of those present fills the room and chaos reigns. So one of the women takes advantage of it to escape and alert the neighbors. This woman is quite old, so that's why she is able to escape. Joseph didn't believe she could do it. However, by the time police arrived at the scene, the criminals had already fled. While they were on the run, Joseph took the opportunity to take off his bloody shirt, wash the stains on the body in a puddle, and throw the knife and gun into the bushes. After that, They used the city bus as a getaway. That escape plan was terrible. Police found Joseph's bloody shirt with his last name on the collar of the shirt, the weapons used with his fingerprints, as well as the match between the sketches made by the police and the descriptions given by witnesses. They didn't even bother to cover their faces. And not to mention other key detail, the disgusting odor that the shoemaker gave off. Really, it was too disgusting. So, after some days on the run, police found and arrested both Joseph and Michael Kallinger. They had both testimonial and biological evidence, so it was irrefutable. They were guilty. During the trial, the shoemaker always tried to make use of his mental problems by carrying a Bible in his hands and blaming God for his crimes. He said that Charlie, the voice in his head, whispered to him to kill all of humanity, excusing his actions because he was only following God's orders. It remembered me some of the Germans from 1945. I was just following orders. It doesn't work like that, my friend. Despite his schizophrenia, the jury considered him mentally sane, and he received a life sentence for all the horrible things he did.
What do you think of the death penalty?
I'm opposed to it.
The state has no right to take your life, but you can murder other people?
I don't think anyone has the right to take a life.
Except you?
When I'm under hallucination, I do.
These voices from God, these hallucinations, do you still experience them?
Yes, I do.
Often?
Often.
His life in prison didn't go unnoticed. He behaved violently, threw excrement at the guards, and confronted them. One that stands out is when he set fire to his prison cell, fighting off the guards as they were trying to save him. Apparently, he was trying to fry an egg on his head by covering himself in lighter fluid, cracking the egg on his head, and then lighting it up. Quite funny and ridiculous at the same time. Then he was moved to a more appropriate place, a psychiatric hospital. But this place was not to be of his liking either. And after some more incidents, he was moved to a more strict asylum, one for the criminally insane, the place he should have been sent to in the first place. But to be a strict psychiatric, he acted like he was the owner of the place. He ended up slashing the throat of a fellow inmate, seriously injuring him.
Do you ever feel violent?
Yes, I do.
What do you feel like doing?
Killing people.
You still feel like killing people?
Yes.
Describe the feeling that you get when you feel like killing people.
Well, last March 11th, I was hallucinating, and I took a razor blade and I cut a man's throat.
Here in the hospital?
Here in the hospital.
After 20 years in prison, Joseph Kallinger died of heart failure in 1996, leaving his last words.
And despite God's promise that I would become God, today I am not God. All I am is a mental patient outside the world that fueled my rage.
It's unknown whether or not Kallinger had replaced God, but I bet that if he did, the world would become a very interesting place. In case you're wondering, his little accomplice, his son, Michael Kallinger, was proven to have acted under the coercion of his father, so he was sent to a reformatory, but was released at the age of 21 and then got a new identity and vanished. Nobody knows his current whereabouts, so probably he's walking around in our streets. Can you imagine him as your neighbor? Scary.
I'm a patient person, got a good listening ear, and try to help people.
You're patient, with a good ear, and you try to help people.
Yes.
When you're not trying to murder them.
Yes.